me close this door.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of our 18F Design Speaker Series. Today will be broadcast to a live stream audience who can view and participate in our discussion. The format for today's talk is a 45 to 60-minute presentation followed by a Q&A. Web folks can ask questions on Twitter by using the hashtag 18FLive. We're very excited to welcome Matthew Milland today. He'll be speaking to us about the value of mindset and how teams and organizations can use the creation and development of a shared mindset to improve their ability to work as a cohesive team. Matthew's the founder and design lead at Normative. A veteran of startups, Matthew also has extensive experience that ranges from Fortune 500 firms to robotics and augmented reality startups. Please join me in welcoming Matthew.
I know, people clapping in a room and lots online. Thanks, folks. Let me know if I'm in the right place, if you can see me. Yeah, no problem. I'm just going to do this. So I have a few speaker notes, but not a lot. So thanks for inviting me into your place. I'm a huge fan of what you folks are doing. I can't stress that enough. I very strongly believe that design and technology are some of the most important levers that we can use to change the world. So the work that folks like you are doing is really, really important. So opportunity to come here and speak to you and tell you all some interesting stuff. It's fantastic. So I'm going to talk to you today about the power of mindset. I'm okay in terms of audio for the folks on the web. Great. Let's jump to the next slide and get started. So this is an MVP, minimal viable presentation. I build most of my presentations over time. It takes about 2 years to go from a test to something serious. This is the third pass of this. The last group of folks who saw it gave me some really good feedback, so hopefully you'll see that. And so as I'm going through, feel free to interrupt me, ask me questions, all kinds of other stuff. I'm really working on this to really hone it and make sure that it's valuable to folks. Let's jump ahead. So today I'm going to try and cover a couple of different things. The first is, what is mindset? That's a really tricky question. I'm going to try and put some space around that so we can understand it. What does it look like in the wild? How can you create it? What are some of the things that you can do? And I'll talk a little bit about what I've learned from other folks and some of the stuff we're trying. And then why does it matter? Okay. And if at any point stuff seems complicated or you'd like me to move faster, I can totally do that. So here's the core idea, and something that 7 or 8 years ago wasn't even on my radar. And now, as somebody who takes design and design as a strategic tool for organizations really seriously, this designing your mindset is one of the most important things that you can do as a team. And when you start to understand the value of what mindset can do at the team level and specifically within larger organizations, having a really clear mindset is really important, not just for how you influence organizations, but also how you keep consistency in terms of how you think and act. Cool. I'm going to start with something that's known as the mother of all demos. Does anyone know what the mother of all demos is? Yeah, so let's go to the next slide. Doug Engelbart, who was generally for years considered to be a bit of a crackpot in the computer science community in the early, mid, late 60s, did this demo in 1968 as part of a technology showcase that SRI, Stanford Research Institute, was doing. It's generally considered to be one of the most influential demos in the history of computation. Basically, everything that you see and use today, everything from the mouse to copy and paste and all kinds of other things, was all shown in this demo. It's worth going on YouTube and watching it. It's incredible. And before this, people didn't have a lot of respect, or they didn't care that much for Doug and his ideas. And after this demo, as I think the quote is, people said it was like he wielded lightning with both hands. So it's pretty powerful. Let's jump to the next slide. What's really actually more interesting and important here from a mindset perspective is that this entire demo was designed, and it was designed to communicate very specific purposes. And the person who played a big role in that was this young cameraman, Stuart Brand, who is responsible for a lot of other things over the years, including being one of the founders of Wired Magazine and the Long Now Foundation and stuff like that. Fairly influential person. But what's important here is that the way in which the perspectives that Engelbart had, they were designed, they were put together into a very specific thing. And so if you jump down to the next slide there, Stuart Brand was really putting his philosophy, his mindset, the things that he really valued into the work that Engelbart had done. So Engelbart had this raw material, but Brand and a number of other people framed it. And what's really important about this is that countercultural perspective that Brand really believed in, that resulted in things like the Whole Earth Catalog and early social computing things like the Well and stuff like that, all came from a mindset being applied to knowledge or information. It was framed, it was polarized, and that perspective made it very interesting and valuable. So what I'll say very simply is that Brand essentially took Engelbart's work and applied a very specific mindset to it. And that network mindset is actually the mindset that really defined how a lot of the modern internet was put together. So jump to the next slide. If you're interested in this in detail, there's a really good, interesting book on this subject. It's called From Counterculture to Cyberculture. And it essentially talks about how Brand and other contemporaries played a significant role in driving the internet to the place it is today. Not directly, but most of the folks who created the modern technology of the internet in the 80s and 90s were all heavily influenced by these folks. What you see here is you see the influence of a small number of people in a very powerful mindset shaping a large portion of society. And so it's really important to understand that mindset, a very deliberate mindset, it's a powerful tool and it can operate at scale. Great book, a lot of fun. It was somebody's PhD thesis. Don't let that scare you off. It's actually really good. And I would highly recommend it, because after understanding that mindset was what mattered here, you really start to understand the scale at which you can operate when you have a great mindset. So what is mindset? Well, let's see. My notes here say that in decision theory or systems theory, it's a set of assumptions, it's methods, it's notations held by one person or groups of people. And it's established so that it creates a powerful incentive within those people or groups to continue to adopt and reinforce certain types of behaviors, actions, perspectives, choices, and tools. It creates what's known as a form of mental inertia. Sometimes it gets described in critical ways as groupthink, because it's very difficult to counteract its effects once it's kind of been entrenched. There's better definitions, though. I think it's this one. It's a philosophical stance which is codified in the mind, but unlike something that is a little bit more structured or rigid like dogma or doctrine, it is malleable and flexible and can change. So one of the important things about mindset is it's not just about a set of rules that you subscribe to. It's actually somewhere between thinking and feeling for a lot of folks. It's really almost like a shared will. Up to the next one here. Quite simply, it's a way of seeing the world, and that's how I like to think about it. It's how you see the world. It's your worldview, and that can be your individual worldview. It can be your shared worldview. Jump ahead a little bit. So, shared worldview thing, in my mind, is really important, because people can do really interesting things at scale, and when you start to get shared perspectives, you get interesting effects. We'll go to the next slide. Does anyone know who this individual is? Y'all got touchscreen phones and all that other fun stuff. This is Alan Kay from Xerox PARC. He's responsible for things like the ideas behind tablet computing and all kinds of other stuff. This is the quote that most people associate him with, which is the best way to predict the future is to invent it. So if you've heard that quote, that's him. Let's go to the next slide. That's my favorite quote of his, which is perspective is worth 80 IQ points. And when we're talking about mindset and mindset as perspective, that's critical. Having a perspective, even a poor one on something, even a weak one, is one of the best things you can do. When I think about shared perspective or shared mindset and the scaling power of that, I think you get a situation where you get to multiply the IQ points. So let's jump to the next slide. Does anyone recognize these folks? Yeah. This was the Macintosh design team. Son, Steve Jobs, he kind of came later. They all got stuck in a building off campus, and they literally thought differently about stuff. They flew a pirate flag and all kinds of other things. And, they're not the perfect example of what a shared mindset can do. But a small number of people who believe that things can be a certain way and follow that through with action is really, really powerful. And so you really can't discount A, the value of perspective, and B, the value of shared perspective, because shared perspective is a very powerful thing. And I think in a lot of ways, one of the most powerful levers you can actually have as a team, as people doing intentional stuff. So jump to the next slide. In a lot of cases, if you go out there into the world and look at the initial literature, there's a lot of really good stuff out there, but it's very binary framing. So you'll see a lot of stuff about the fixed mindset versus the growth mindset, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But essentially, the idea of the fixed mindset is that you have a perspective where you accept the world for what it is, and that you can't really change it, and you respond to the world and it responds to you, but you don't really have a significant amount of agency in that respect. Whereas the growth mindset is essentially, I believe that I can change the world and I can shape the world. And because of that perspective, I'm willing to try new things and learn new things and all kinds of stuff like that. And lots of stuff in the coaching field and the child rearing field and everything else about you want your player or you want your child to have a growth mindset because a growth mindset is really important. But again, what's happening here, and we'll jump to the next slide, you'll sometimes see the entrepreneurial mindset. People describe the growth mindset as the entrepreneurial mindset. Learning is a very important thing in that. Next. Unfortunately, what's happening is you're seeing a lot of binary comparison, X versus Y. You've got two choices. You can have the bad mindset or the good mindset. And the good mindset is usually about learning. The bad mindset is usually about being afraid of learning. And it's not actually that simple. And one of the reasons why I believe mindset doesn't get considered enough in terms of how you shape and lead teams and do work and things like that is because people are being told you have two choices around your mindset. You can be somebody who learns and believes they can change the world, or you can be somebody who accepts it for what it is. And it's a little bit more nuanced than that. The world isn't quite so black and white. Next. I actually believe that it's better to think about mindset as orientation or your stance, your position, and you can basically pick or choose or create almost any position or way of seeing the world that you want. You don't have to be a growth mindset, although that's a nice component or part of your thinking that you can have. And you also don't have to be fixed. You don't have to be entrepreneurial, but you can be somebody who has some of those perspectives wrapped up in other things that you do or think about. Your stance, what I'm saying here, literally can be designed as opposed to chosen from a set of choices. The person who I think, and initially by accident, and then very deliberately later his life, who really informed a lot of this, was a Air Force officer named John Boyd. Some folks may be familiar with Boyd's stuff. If you're not, it's very interesting work. Some people think that he was the greatest strategist of the last 2,000 years. More influential than Sun Tzu, and other people think he was a little challenging and really wasn't that influential. Regardless, he was from about 1960 to 1985 a really important iconoclast in terms of thinking and strategic theory, and a lot of the you can definitely in the armed forces see his influence once you're familiar with his work. And then you also see his influences we'll see in a bit in other places, a little bit more surprising. Go to the next slide. So his work on mindset and stance and, as he would say, orientation began in the 1950s. He joined the Air Force a little too late to see service in World War II, and ended up being a fighter pilot and did a lot of practice sorties, and he became known as 42nd Boyd. And so the story was that he would say, I'll bet you $20 that I can start here and you can start here, and within 40 seconds, I'll be behind you, which is pretty hard to do. And he would consistently win the $20. And he would do it with a technique called plating the bird. I'm assuming some of you here have seen Top Gun, right? So you know that scene where Maverick's flying along and he slams on the brakes and the other person flies right by. So that's plating the bird, and it's a maneuver where you unexpectedly put on the brakes and the other individual flies by you. And Boyd would do that every time, and people are, how is he doing this? And what he described was that in his mind, he was starting to think about the world as faster cycles, and he would get multiple decision cycles out in front of his adversary. And so while the adversary would be following him, responding to him, he'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cycles out, playing all the scenarios, understanding all that stuff, and then with that perspective saying, I know now that when I do this, that person is not going to anticipate it because my mind is much further ahead than they are. And what's really important about this is he actually started to generate a formal model for decision-making, and quite frankly, for making decision-making in a way in which you're almost always guaranteed success of your decision. If we jump to the next slide, that's known as the OODA loop. And you'll see it called different things in different places. For those of you who come from startup land or follow startup culture, you might find this surprising, but if you jump to the next slide, that's the OODA loop. So the customer development model, which Steve Blank popularized, and basically every startup under the sun is held to by their investors, is the OODA loop. And it's observe, orient, decide, and act. And where the pivot is right where it should be. If we go to the next slide, which is right here. So let's talk about this a little bit, because the loop is a fairly complicated thing that this person, Boyd, was actually very uncomfortable writing down. He said, I can't really make a model or a picture of how I think and how I feel and how I make decisions. That seems a little bit unusual. I'm going to try all the same. So essentially, if you think about the model, it's a feedback loop like this. So you look at what's happening in the world, you orient yourself in a way in which you think you're going to be successful. You use that hypothesis to make a decision, and then you act and you test. And whether you're using this to launch a startup or fly a jet fighter or anything else like that, it's the same model. Now, what's really interesting in here is this notion of orientation. You can see that orientation is by far the biggest and most complex and messiest thing. And in Boyd's language, he was saying your orientation is your cultural traditions, it's your genetic heritage, it's new information, it's previous experience. It's analysis, breaking problems apart in many pieces, and synthesis, integrating things together. Its orientation is what really, really makes stuff work, right? If you go back one slide, in customer development, startups trying to find product market fit, that orientation thing is the most important thing they do. That's where you do the product market fit interviews and all these other things. And so when you start to understand that orientation is really powerful, and it's also not something that is a simple black and white thing, you start to understand that orientation, let's jump ahead a couple slides again, orientation is actually your mindset. And Boyd was not really 7 or 8 loops in front of people. His mindset allowed him to see the world differently. He was very uncomfortable taking something like this and turning it into a diagram. In fact, if you jump to the next slide, the only time he ever drew it was here. And he was basically forced to draw it, and you can see it's pretty messy. He wasn't a big fan of it, and he also talked about the fact that it's not really a loop, it's a stance, it's a whole way of being. And so even when people are saying, orientation is really important here, let's jump forward a slide. Mindset's the whole thing. Mindset is how you see the world, how you act in the world, how you frame it, the decisions you make. It's all a single thing, which means that it's kind of complicated, right? So how do you boil that down and make it a little bit simpler? Let's take it a step further and go to the next slide. Any cognitive science grads here, or user researchers, or folks like that? There's this cognitive science principle called the extended mind, and essentially the argument, and it's a very popular one these days, suggests that most of our mind doesn't exist in here. It actually exists out in the world, and every time you're putting a sticky note up on the wall or pushing a button or doing something else, when you manipulate the world is actually your mind, and it's a shared knowledge space. And so we're actually out in the wild sharing a mind. We are not actually brains and bats. I know, blowing a couple minds here. There are people way more knowledgeable about this stuff than me, but it's very powerful. So this explains why putting sticky notes on a wall actually works, and why when you put the sticky notes up, it makes it work even better, because you start to develop shared language, shared perspective, shared model. And when you have a shared model in your mind, that's pretty powerful. And when you have a shared model of how you want to do stuff in your mind, a mindset, that's really, really powerful. So let's jump forward a little bit. You see this all the time in sports teams. Any Golden State Warrior fans? Yeah? No? Okay. I'm sadly a Toronto Raptors fan, and they lost last night. I was very disappointed. A great team. Some stars, but they're really a seriously great team. And when you watch great teams play, it doesn't matter the sport, or it doesn't have to be a sport, but great teams seem like they're operating from a single body of information, a single mind. And the way that they do things, whether they're a defensive team or they do certain schemes or everything else. Basketball is a great example, because in my perspective, it is not just about the players sharing the stuff. They're operating as a single unit, and that's how they win and lose. And what's really interesting, if you jump ahead another slide, is that it's not only that you're extending the mind in the world and operate as a single unit, you're sharing that mindset. And that's why you have things like this. Fans. Why are you a Golden State fan, even if you live 3,000 miles away? You're starting to understand that shared mindset, that shared perspective. People talk very glibly about, we're totally feeding off the energy of the crowd and everything else. Well, there's something shared there, and there's a shared understanding of how this all works as a single unit of understanding, as opposed to it's just a bunch of players passing the ball around. It's a much more sophisticated thing. And fans, what do fans do after games? They go on parades when you win the World Series or stuff like that. Why do people do that? Because they are feeding off of this type of stuff. And so the influence of how this small group of players plays, it's not just the fact that they win, it's how they win that defines their identity. And in military studies, the how you win question in a business is really important. And part of that is a function of mindset. Let's jump to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about what this stuff looks like in the wild, and specifically what, let me just jump ahead here. Cognition looks like in the wild. I'm running a little slow, so I'm going to speed up a tiny bit. Jump to the next slide. If you really want to see what this stuff looks like and you really want to have your mind blown, go read that book. But essentially, the best way of describing a basketball arena, like I just showed you, is that's a giant computer with lots of people and lots of memory solving problems. This book is great. You can also probably find it as a free PDF download online. Essentially what it talks about is cognition is a form of problem solving, a form of computation. Individual problem solving units, people are pretty good if you navigate. And the book is all around, they studied navigators at sea in like Polynesian ships and in naval vessels and things like that. And what's really interesting is that if you look at cognition as systems, as integrated sets of interactions, you can get much better navigation and navigational problem solving when people operate together with a shared perspective, a shared mindset. The individuals ladder up to a much more important type of outcome. Let's jump ahead. Now, as designers, this mindset stuff sounds really interesting, but we have spent the majority of our time over the last 30 years or so actually working down in the lower levels of design theory. We haven't really been thinking a lot about mindset. I'm sure everybody here who works in design knows all kinds of design methods or research methods or approaches or things like that. And those will usually be rolled up into a methodology, which is the processes and systems and workflows that you use to work with different individuals. So if you look at methods as the tools and activities, there are tons of methods that have been developed for design out in the wild in the last 30 years or so, and they're awesome. There are lots of methodologies, and not just in design, but in similar fields in business and technology. But there's not a huge amount of work being done in mindset, which is really interesting because there's kind of a shortage of frames and stances and perspectives on what design is. And if you go to the next slide and talk about user experience design, that's pretty much the only mindset we use these days as designers. We just assume that that's the default mindset. In fact, we don't even really think about it. But that's a mindset, as I'll talk about later, that has been taught and sold, and nobody questions it. And it's not that it's bad, but people don't understand that that is the mindset of most design practice. Make it easier for people to do things. So, in this case, the mindset is implied, and it's generally accepted to be things like human-centered design, experience design, agile methods. I would actually consider one of the most interesting mindsets in our field that you could kind of study right now is what's happening in the DevOps movement. The DevOps movement there's some really serious, interesting stuff out there. There's a book you should all check out, pretty short, by a guy named Jeff Sussna. It's called Designing Delivery. It's all it's an O'Reilly book. It's all this stuff, systems theory, everything else, but a different mindset. Jeff Sussna. I can get you the stuff afterwards. But if you're into delivery in a serious way, and I think probably a lot of folks are, he's one of the most interesting thinkers out there right now. This person, next slide. Some of you may have heard of Adaptive Path. They were one of the world's first user experience perspectives. Peter Merholtz was one of the founders. This is one of my favorite quotes about mindset, and I think a really good way to think about the value of it. So the most important thing in delivering a great experience is mindset, not design skills, processes, or methods. The right mindset can overcome deficit in those areas, but a brilliant craft can't compensate for a weak mindset. Right? So you can have the best practitioners, the best capabilities, the best tools, the best everything, but if you don't have a shared common perspective that allows you to pursue a vision as a group, you're at risk in terms of doing what you need to do. So mindset's a critical part in my perspective, and I think of many other folks, of effective design practice. Your vision, your values, your principles, they're all essential. So how do you create a mindset? Let's jump ahead a little bit. I think part of the way to understand that is maybe to look at some examples of mindset in the wild. Does anyone remember the Apple Think Different campaign? Yeah. Great example of awesome advertising campaign. Jobs brought in, I think it was Chiat Day or something like that, and they went, and let's jump to the next slide. They brought all these individuals in, and these individuals are all folks who would kind of fit into what we call the growth mindset. They all believe they could change the world by learning. Muhammad Ali, Amelia Earhart, Richard Feynman, all iconic figures in their fields. And so here's an advertising campaign which is rebooting the brand of a challenged corporation, and they're basically differentiating themselves on mindset, saying that mindset is valuable. If you jump to the next slide, people have asked Jobs about the Think Different campaign. Oh, well, it's just a campaign. They came up with it. He said, I hear you, it's a campaign, but at the same time, the minute you understand that you can change the world, once you learn that, you'll never be the same again. From that perspective, that you can actually change, I mean, that's what that whole campaign was about. That's a big part, even to this day, of why Apple is successful. I mean, Apple has all kinds of different things going on in terms of their mindset, but they literally believe they can change the world. You listen to their language, put a dent in the universe. There's a lot more to Apple's success than mindset for sure, but that's an example of mindset in the wild, right? And people who go to work at Apple, people who worked at Apple, they do believe that they have that capability and that power. They do believe that they can change the world and they can lead that type of change. Let's jump to the next. So let's talk a little bit about learning mindsets in the wild. Next one. Let's talk a little bit about the environmental field. How many people here have heard of a book called Silent Spring? Right, early 60s, somebody came and said, DDT and all these chemicals, bad stuff, right? And that was one of the first kind of moments of awakening for people to understand that thinking critically about the environment was a thing, regardless of whether you believed in this or that or the other thing. It was a conversation to be had. And what's really interesting is not whether you agree with environmentalism or not, but to actually watch how its perspective or mindset changed between 1962 and 1987. 1987 being the launch of this big study called the Brundtland Report, which essentially said, it's called Our Common Future, and essentially said this is how we're going to think about the world and the world around us. So if you jump to the next slide, the mindset for dealing with the environment in the early and late 60s was all framed around the language of management. Environment, hey man, long time no see. Good to see you. It was all framed around the language of management. And you manage the environment. And as people started to realize that, that's a pretty complex system, managing it is really tough. People responded. Next slide. You actually started people to say, okay, maybe we can't necessarily manage everything. Maybe we actually need to shift our perspective and really focus on conservation. You can see the language in the early to mid 70s really shift to this notion of conservation. Every program was a conservation, and we had conservation areas and all kinds of other things. So the mindset not only shaped the understanding, but also shaped the types of programs and things that came out of it. And then running into the late 70s and early 80s, next slide, you actually start to see the language of stewardship come into play, which was not that we're going to conserve it to make sure we don't get any more, but it's our job to actually steward or shepherd the environment along. And so you start to see different types of programs, government initiatives come out where this perspective or this language was really driving things. And then finally, you get to the language which is more common today, which is the language of sustainability. But the notion of sustainability as a mindset and a framework for thinking about people's relationship with the environment wasn't where the mindset started in terms of people's thought. It started way back in management. So what's important here is that as a learning mindset, as the environmental field really started to think about what their relationship was with that, the language started to change. And that's actually really important to understand, because the changing language, the learning, is something we're going to get back to a little bit later. It's critical that you use language and study the language when you're shaping mindset. Anyone know who these jokers are? Charles and Ray Eames, some classic designers, a great example of learning mindset. They basically played their way through a career in a really positive way. Let's quickly go to the next slide. They had this perspective, which I call ALB, always be learning. It's kind of like Glengarry Glen Ross, always be closing, always learning. If you actually go and study them a little bit, you understand there's a really interesting set of principles they have in this book. It's kind of 15 principles for how their mindset worked. It's all about playing. I mean, one of their principles was like just to basically try puns out on everything. Like wordplay was one of the core tenets of how they did their great design work. And so essentially you had organizations like IBM hiring people whose principle around problem solving was like wordplay. And why wordplay? Because wordplay helped them see the world differently and learn differently. So very similar to these other things we're seeing, definitely a learning and growth oriented mindset as part of their mindset, not their whole mindset. Let's jump to the next one. I'm going to talk about a real interesting tactical example of this that I fell into discovering a number of years ago. This is a tiny little company out in Tahoe called Praxis Skis. They're a ski company. They make about 1,000 pairs a year. For all intents and purposes, they should not be players in the industry whatsoever. Next slide. This is their shop. I mean, they're awesome. They're also like, on the surface, a bunch of ski bums, right? I've been to their place. It's full of like resin and epoxy and smelly plastic and all kinds of other things. And you'd say, like, what's going on here? Like, is there anything special? Like, why are they considered to be so important in the ski industry? Jump to the next slide. They're generally considered by some folks in the industry to be the most innovative designer manufacturers of skis out there for a bunch of different reasons. One of them is that they've set up their prototyping process so they can test a new pair of skis every single day. So while most folks in this industry will go through 2 or 3 prototypes a year, these folks prototype every single day. And so their process in terms of evolution and learning is very different. And they don't see, like, there's this whole talk about, hardware is hard and all this other stuff. They don't see that. They're just like, okay, so we want to try this new thing. We're going to throw it together in the morning and it'll be ready by the afternoon. And we'll go do some evening skiing and it's done. Right. They also, if you jump to the next slide, crowdsource a lot of the input into how their skis are designed. So they go on forums, they'll get groups of people together, order custom runs of stuff and all kinds of other things. And essentially you've got this small group of people who are doing all these incredibly growth and learning oriented stuff. and it creates some really interesting results. So jump to the next slide. This is the team, right? What's the impact that they have? Let's jump to the next slide. In certain parts of the skiing industry, the people who are winning all the competitions are all, jump to the next slide, jump to the next slide, their gear. Next. So when you're doing this, and when you're looking at the impact, these folks have a very specific mindset, and it has, for a very small team, it has a very huge global impact. I mean, I'll tell you, they're paying a lot of money to have that there, and that person wants to use that stuff. And that's where you want to be when you're creating stuff. And why is there stuff like that? So I asked them. Next slide. They don't design the ski, they think about designing the turn, right? So they have completely changed their perspective and their mindset. They don't think about, I'm designing a thing. They think I'm designing the outcome of what a thing could do. And so that frees them from having to think about this stuff. And in our industry, that's kind of like the screen. You know, you're not really designing the screen, you're designing the outcomes that come from the screens or the language or all these other things. And so when I'm talking about like a bunch of quasi ski bums who also put people on World Cup podiums, what I'm really talking about here is they've done something in terms of mindset, which is really, really powerful. So they've started to understand what is the real thing that they're designing, right? They're designing the feel that comes out of a perfect turn. You know, the ski in a lot of ways is actually kind of inconsequential to them. Let's keep rolling so they don't totally run out of time. So we've been talking about shared mindset. Quickly, next slide. Great place to learn about that is Pixar. If any of you have read Creativity Inc., read between the lines in Creativity Inc. Ed Catmull was talking all about modeling behavior and intent so that mindset can be formed, so that teams can understand how to run, so that you can have teams run autonomously and be very successful with a shared mindset. Next. The way I've heard this described is the chief repeating officer. I was at a conference once and sitting around with a bunch of folks, maybe 40 or 50 folks who all ran design businesses. And everyone was complaining about how hard it was to get everyone on the same page. And this one person who'd been doing it for a long time and had about 100 people in their business, they said, you know, think of it like this. I'm the chief repeating officer, and my job is just basically repeat the same couple of things over and over and over. I'm the CEO, and all I do is repeat the same 2 or 3 things over and over and over, and not because I'm simple, but because that is the best use of my time, is to use the language that gets everybody to think the same way, right? That's the critical piece of this type of stuff, the shared language. And so when you have someone like Ed Catmull, you know, Ed Catmull just basically is the chief repeating officer. He takes a few simple things, repeats them over and over and over. And that's part of the responsibility that you have if you want to be able to do work as a team in a certain way. Go ahead. Stanley McChrystal, some of you may be familiar with his work. He has a great book out called Team of Teams. Talks a lot about how you can essentially take mindset and capability and use it to reshape how groups of people act in very complex environments. I won't get into it in too much detail, but essentially, if you want to really understand what mindset looks like from a design, how do you design mindset from an executional perspective, it's a great book and very, very much related to what we're talking about right now. Let's jump ahead a little bit to the next slide. Here's one of the most important things that mindset can do, and why it's important to have a deliberate mindset and a shared mindset, because mindset influences the uncommitted. This is one of the things Boyd talked about. The value of mindset is you influence the uncommitted or potential adversaries, so they're drawn towards your philosophy and, more important, empathetic to your success. Right. So the idea here is that if your mindset is visible, it not only becomes something that you can use to see the world, also becomes something else that people can adopt, because there's a sense of purpose that comes with a good mindset. And so being very deliberate, being the chief repeating officer, and our mindset is user-centered. You say user-centered over and over and over. Eventually, the world believes that that's a good way of doing things. Next slide. The reason why this works is that essentially, if you change language in small but deliberate ways, you change systems. There's a book, you can find the PDF online. It's literally referred to as a little gray book. It was a document that was created for Sun Microsystems in the early 2000s to reshape how parts of their organization work. Like, how do you put a mindset into a large organization when words is one of the best ways to do it? Well, of course, you write a little book. So Paul Pangaro, who teaches at SVA up in New York, and Hugh Dubberly, who used to be creative director at Apple, they're the folks behind this. And essentially they said, our job is to make a mindset happen. How do we do that? I go around and ask our clients, what are you looking for from your design firm? One of the interesting things that one of them said to me a couple of months ago was looking to assimilate everything right? That's what this stuff is trying to do, right? Assimilation, bringing ideas in, creating more of that mindset, more of that direction, more of that shared purpose. More glibly, the wind in your sails. So next slide. In a lot of ways, the mindset is the message. In the design industry, there is one organization that has done that better than anybody else. That is IDEO. How many people have heard of IDEO? Anyone not heard of IDEO? Yeah. IDEO is considered to be one of the most important design firms of the last 25 years or so. In the early 90s, IDEO was actually 3 little companies with about 7 or 8 people each, and they all banded together and named themselves IDEO. Nobody remembers that they were actually a bunch of small shops. They all banded together and they renamed themselves IDEO. From what I understand, after a company picnic, they said, we should probably focus on being a little bit more ambitious than just making payroll. Yeah, it was literally that conversation. And so over a period of 10 years, they went through a really, really powerful exercise where they basically split the market for industrial design firms. They said, there's industrial design firms, and then there's us. We are human-centered. They are not. And they ran a campaign, PR campaign, on the notion of being human-centered and user experience. And they did it so well that everybody now believes that that's just the way that you think about design. Design has to be human-centered. But up until IDEO, that wasn't a thing. So what's important to think about here is, yes, being human-centered is really important, but you have leeway and leverage to have a different perspective. And there's actually value in thinking about it in a broader way. User experience is super valuable, but user experience and what? Don't just take for granted that the right way of doing stuff is being human-centered, because that was IDEO taking some research for a few folks and turning it into a big PR push over 15 years. That's why it's dominant. That's why it's out there. Not because it is the default mindset for doing design work. Let's jump to the next slide really quickly. Next. So mindset is messaging. I'm going to talk really quickly, and maybe it actually makes sense for me to just kind of point when I need the slides done. I'm going to talk really quickly about some of the stuff that we've been experimenting at, because as I started going and say, where are books on designing mindset? How can you design a mindset for design firm? I couldn't find anything. So we started sharing what we learned. Next. So I'm going to talk very quickly about some of the experiments we've been doing at our firm. The first is that we've essentially said we want to have an integrative mindset, and part of that is understanding that the mindset around growth and shared understanding and computational stuff and the message, that's all important. So we're not going to throw all the old stuff out, but we're going to deliberately actually look and say, okay, we need this stuff as part of what we're doing. Next. Next. We start out like every other design firm, which basically like cloud of chaos. Anybody who works in design knows that at some point it's pretty messy. And when we started out, we didn't have a mindset. We're just like, this is really interesting work, let's do it. But as we started to grow, and as we started to compete, and as we started to work with more senior people, it became very clear that we were missing something. Next. And so we started talking about that. And literally, we have spent the last 5.5 years designing our mindset by having conversations in the organization. Next. And essentially what it boils down to is we talk about stories about two things, networks and scale. Those are the things that are really important to us. So human-centered, all that other stuff's important, but we want to understand what networks mean in the world and what scale means in the world. Next. And so we're just going through the exercise that lots of other folks go through around shared language and shared learning, but we're doing it very deliberately because we're literally trying to design something. So the conversations really do matter. Next. And internally, we call that conversation DFTN, which just means design for the network. We're asking that question. What does it mean to design for the network? Next. And so where a lot of that stuff happens is, things like Slack. So we have a Slack channel and people just like post stuff. Does this feel kind of like DFTN? Okay, if it is, I'll post it. I'll see what works. But we're actually trying to put a label and language around certain things so that we can start to understand, does this actually fit? Is this actually something that informs our mindset, or is it just something interesting to read? And so when we do something like this, we're posting and actually saying, oh, there's this, there's this, there's this. Do they fit? Next. This is actually, I found this recently. This is an early example of us trying to articulate our mindset. That's why I had to take the screenshot. It's pretty messy. I read it now and I go like, oh my goodness. Who are these jokers? But it's really important to go and struggle through the mess of doing that type of stuff and using language to kind of articulate what you're doing and then produce things with that language. Next. Then we went through this stage where it was like try to be very complex and it's computational capability. Next. Computational design. We're creating culture with network systems. Like that's what our design practice is. Next. We've talked about all kinds of things. We're still talking about these things. But what we've learned, if you just want to go to the next slide, is that our mindset can be articulated much more simply. And so now we simply have two elements to our mindset. The first is we think in systems. Everything's a system all the time. And then the next is we dream in software. And for us, that's our mindset. That's how we frame everything that we do. And when we talk with a client and we go into a room where we talk with a partner, everybody has those ideas in their head as how they frame conversations, how they talk, how they problem solve, all kinds of other things. Doesn't mean that we don't care about human-centered or any of that other stuff, but we've gone through the exercise of trying to design a mindset. And what's interesting now is that it's actually really starting to work. And what's surprising for us is that the language that we were using 2 or 3 years ago that didn't make any sense to folks is now people are starting to use it with us. And so often when you create a mindset, and it's important to invest in a mindset that you believe in as opposed to just create one that fits. If you create one with purpose and you start to develop it, eventually it will find a place where it can do good work. So we do a lot of work with companies that work on blockchain technology, which is kind of weird. How do we end up doing that? Well, the way that we think about stuff as designers kind of fits with the way that people think about that type of stuff. So often your mindset will find fit. And if you want to influence and help people think about things better, fit matters. Next. Learning through action. I'll just talk through this super quickly. We did a whole project where we basically said, what does this look like if we stop talking about it and start actually articulating it? This is how we met that ski company. We went and we built networked ski equipment from scratch. We're trying to figure out what does this stuff actually look like. So instead of talking about it, what does it look like to actually understand our mindset from a building perspective? So we said, what if we thought about skiing from a data first perspective as opposed to turns or all kinds of other things? So you can just flip through these. And so we went through the whole prototyping process and all the data and everything else. The whole purpose for us, though, was not to make a shippable product. It was never to do that. It was always for us to better understand what our mindset looked like, right, and what it was. And as designers, we felt that that was a really important thing to do. The act of making stuff was going to help us think about it, because if we only used words, it would only be one form of conversation. So when you're thinking about, like, you're redesigning a website, you're working on the information architecture or navigation or labeling for something, when you're making something, think about it in the same way with the ski project that we did, that you were actually developing your mindset, testing your mindset, refining your mindset, not just through what you say, but what you make, right? That's an expression of what you are. It's your perspective. It's your perspective expressed as an output. It's one of the things that changes people's minds. Next. So I think in our world, and this is why this matters, and I think why it's really important to folks like you, there's two big new levers that you can apply to really make change happen. And the first is mindset, having a unique shared perspective as a group, a belief that things can be a certain way. And two, the second thing is software. Next slide. So if you think about the purpose of design is essentially to create culture with things, then graphic design creates culture with symbols. Next, industrial design creates culture with objects. Next, and software design creates culture with software or systems. Next, and what we're seeing with stuff like Uber, it's a scaled thing, right? So your work that you do with software, it's not a one-to-one. It's one of the most powerful scaling tools that has ever been developed, and the reach, especially in network environments, is powerful. So the mindset you apply to design software is really important, because it gets expressed, your principles, your ideas, your beliefs, which you believe in. You drive change at scale by doing that. And so when you talk about doing this, as soon as you put the word digital into it, you're talking about what does it mean to apply a perspective, a mindset with software, digital technology, to change that at scale, right? Not that you were the only driver. There are lots of drivers in this, but essentially what you're doing is you're playing in the scale thing with the two most powerful tools: the perspective, how you influence, and software, which is something that we're barely beginning to tap out how that works. Next. So let's talk very quickly about delivering with mindset. Next. Now's the time to think differently. Next. I wrote a blog post on this. You can go read it. I would consider the way that you folks, you're essentially a services organization. So this applies to you. The first is that you may feel like you're on the edges. Innovation happens at the edges. That's where you get to test the new language. That's where you get to test the new ideas. That's where you actually get to design your mindset. You're a large organization. The chief repeating officer can't repeat what they're saying enough to change things. But as a smaller group, 150, 250 people, you can actually have the conversation and make the language different. That's important. Next, don't compete. Your job is not to compete or to challenge. Your mindset is there to provide perspective. And quite frankly, the tension, and designers should get this, the tension between opposing ideas is where some of the best design outcomes come from. And the sharper and more unique your mindset as a group, the more likely that it's going to create that positive creative tension with existing mindsets from perspectives and institutions. That's going to drive change. So that is really, really important. Your perspective, in a lot of ways, is probably your most important product. Okay, next. And that's a sweet spot for teams like yours, is seeing the world differently. My sense is that you folks already do see the world differently. That's your heritage as an organization. That's your inertia. I think the opportunity is to be even more deliberate about that. Start to talk about what that looks like, and start to talk about how that perspective positively shapes the things around you. It's not, you didn't get the job because you were different. You got the job because you were capable. Now, seeing things differently, that's the next step, right? Not in a conflict-driven way, Perspective is not about conflict. Perspective is about helping other individuals and other groups see the world differently so that they can evolve their own way of seeing the world on their own terms. You don't work to change people's minds. You work to show them a different perspective so that they can respond and change their own. Next. So the artifact, the team is its mindset. That's the thing you design more than anything else, right? The websites, all that other stuff, you want that stuff to be great. You work on designing your mindset. How do you see the world as a unit, as a group? That's critical. Next. And great influencers, and you can probably start to see this, and there's a lot of example out there. Great influencers lead with mindset. It is that perspective that changes the world that really matters. Next. So why does mindset matter? Next. I think it matters because of this. It's a powerful, unique, and shared way of shaping intent, shaping culture, and shaping change. And I think that for folks that care about the value of design and using design as one of the many ways in which you can make organizations better and culture better, mindset really matters. I think that's the last slide, actually. So, oh no. So these are questions I have for you that you want to work on. How do you think? Next. And how do you dream? Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
That was a little over. It's good.
Yeah, we carved out a little extra space to ask questions if anyone wants to ask questions. Anyone who's joining us remotely can ask questions on Twitter with the hashtag 18FLive.
Cool. Yeah.
You hit on a little bit. I guess I want you to hit on it more.
Sure.
Sort of looking at, my question is, what's the limit on the size of a team that a single person can have this? You know what I mean? Like 7, 150.
I study that a lot. If you're more on the business side of the world, some of you may be familiar with the perspective called the Rockefeller habits. There's a perspective on building, scaling organizations, and part of it's about communication. And one of the tenets of the Rockefeller habits kind of points to, an individual can effectively manage about 7 or 8 other people. And so when you make an organization, whether it's a hierarchy, a network, or some other form, that comes into play. You see that a lot. I can't remember if it was Frog Design in the early days where they talked about like 6 people as kind of the max on a team. So there's a lot of numbers around like small team size. This is why I put the McChrystal stuff in there, the notion of teams, because managing a hierarchy, you're essentially managing teams of teams in a very structured way. More contemporary approaches, you're actually seeing teams managed as a network, and then eventually you're seeing networks manage themselves. But the core units, the small teams, I mean, we see like less than 10 is kind of a unit of composition. That's what I would look towards. You can make teams of teams that have a shared mindset, but you have to understand that when you're pushing things like the Dunbar number around 150 or stuff like that, now you're getting into a situation where you're running the whole chief repeating officer all the time. You're really focusing on the simplest things, like why did I go from like a super complicated way of describing what we do, saying like we dream in software, because I'm basically going around the studio and saying that like every 90 seconds, right? And I'm joking a little bit.
How big is normal?
We're 30 people, and one of the things that we had done was when we had started to talk to companies that had started like 5-10 years before us, or they were peers or things like that. Where do they run into problems? The same place that all organizations run into, all these numbers that you're talking about. And so part of literally how we got into the mindset stuff is we really decided to focus on trying to address some of these problems early on. Not because we want to be massive, but because we want to be able to keep the direction strong. The intent, the purpose, the mindset really matters. Yeah.
So where did you develop your background, or what references did you use for your background in Boyd's decision making?
how many days do you have to talk about Boyd?
As many as you like.
As many as like. In graduate school, I was a systems theory geek and stumbled onto Boyd stuff indirectly, and then this may make sense to you. I read Osenko's PhD thesis before it became the book, where it just like flown around as a PDF. Yeah, no, you guys are like, long story short, I have been thinking about him a lot, and not for some of the reasons that some people expect. But what's really interesting to me is that for a strategist, he used a lot of the language of design, synthesis, integration, all kinds of other things. It's interesting. The word design is almost never used in his work or the work of people who write about him in a way that reflects what we're generally talking about. But when I look at influences on our design practice at Normative, he's definitely one of them. And part of it is because we realized that we had to, even at a very small size, start to institutionalize good decision-making perspectives, and quite frankly, really want to understand what that looked like to turn that into software. A lot of our work is helping organizations understand how do you turn something that people used to do, like part of that, into software, and what do you leave the people do? Like, how do you empower the people? And so his work is really, really interesting. At one point, we reframed our whole business around like the grand strategic, grand tactical stuff, and like try to make like decision pyramids and all kinds of other things. Related to that, we've also paid a lot of attention to what are they called? The folks who used to be out in Leavenworth, the Center for Advanced Design. You heard of them?
What's an army?
It was it was a Booz Allen Hamilton consulting group built for the Army, and they brought in what's his name? He's like the modern version of Boyd, the Israeli guy. Shimon Nave.
Yes.
Right. So say they built a team around Shimon Nave and Alex Ryan and a bunch of other folks, and all these incredibly strategic design thinkers who are all applying design to complex international policy and all kinds of other stuff. Long story short, there's a lot of really interesting fertile ground. And when you get into a systems and network perspective, I'll say that for us, the research in the military field has been much richer over the last 30 years than anything else. I have to go back to like all the cybernetics stuff from the mid to late 60s to actually get to that level of stuff.
Have you been on the Quantico to see Boyd's library?
I have not, although I was trying to go to the thing that they were running every year in Quantico, and then it was canceled. Yeah. So I was planning on going this year for the first year, and then it was canceled about 6 or 7 months ago.
Yes.
Yeah. I have not been there. Would love to go at some point.
It's impressive to see. They've got his library, so they went in and they collected the entire library from
him, which is like he basically spent like a lot of time alone with books.
Yes. So you can actually go in and see the order at which
he went
he
through
looked and learned.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating to see his handwriting in the books.
Yeah, I can imagine. That's pretty impressive. Yeah, I could talk about stuff a lot. I mean, I'm obviously really oversimplifying the OODA loop.
No, you did a great job.
Yeah, but I'm trying to like catch some of the stuff. I really kind of believe in the it's a stance way of looking at it as opposed to the other stuff.
I think the neuroscience is starting to show that it's an equivalent model for executive function.
Oh yeah.
So it's more than just a stance. There's actually 6 loops going on,
and it's the core.
They're simultaneously existing inside of our brain. So.
Well, this is why you should look into the extended mind embodied cognition stuff, because a lot of that stuff is essentially saying that it's the mind is like so much environmental in addition to that type of stuff. So the two things really matter. That's why, having a great design environment matters too.
Actually, we have a question from Slack about the extended mind,
Cool.
Asking if there are actionable ways to improve the functioning of the extended mind, maybe like daily to-dos.
Daily to-dos. You should get another person from our team in to actually talk about that. He's a guy out of Minneapolis called Carl Fast, and he thinks a lot about this. Simple extended mind stuff. Think of it like this: the more visible the environment is around you, the more it becomes part of what you can operate on. So, sticky notes on the wall, they really do matter, and talking about them really matters, because essentially you're really trying to do an input and output process where you're externalizing certain things, you're projecting ideas. I mean, it's mental model creation, all that other stuff, and you buy into the idea, as some of us do, that a lot of the environment is part of the mind. Don't take the stuff off the whiteboard until people absolutely need it. Leave that stuff out there, because that essentially is your memory. And if you talk about that stuff as you do it, it's also really valuable. We did an experiment with a client about 5 years ago, where we did one of those sticky note sorting exercises with them on some huge data set. And they, through the process of talking about the sticky notes as they put them on the wall and talking about how they're classifying, categorizing, everything else, they generated all the insights and the outputs. And we just basically, they knew way more about it. Their minds were primed and everything else. So it was purely them creating the environment. So if you think about the idea of the environment, I would say that's the big thing that you can change, is understand that the information environment is a part of the shared mind. And it's also something that you can create and shape. So that's, leave your stuff out. Don't clean up too quickly, and talk about it. That's a good start. Other questions or thoughts? Yeah, sure.
Can you go back?
Sure.
It was late in the present, but it was where you're talking about words and language.
Oh, the stuff with the Sun Microsystem stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's just go back. That's about 25 slides back, so you'll know when it happens. Keep rolling. Just a little bit further. Dun, 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 dun. Almost there. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that one, so when this came up, I was like, visceral gut reaction here.
Yeah.
So you ended your talk almost by saying, the biggest service you can provide is a perspective, and it's not about conflict. But so what I'm living through is, so we're in the same organization,
right?
So Navy Lab.
Yeah.
I've inserted and used a bunch of language in the last year that I thought was just, this is how everybody thinks.
Yes.
So this is normal. And what I found was it was very
challenging.
Provocative.
Yes, provocative.
And you said it's not about conflict, but
no.
For the last year, I feel like I've been living in a very dramatic conflict where the words that I use have almost been like, no, we're not going to think or talk that way.
Totally.
But it's in direct conflict with a stated desire to have a culture of innovation. And so I don't. Anyway.
So I have some thoughts on that. Yeah, so yeah, definitely. And I have struggled with that for years. And what I've come to believe is there's a difference between conflict and tension, right? And one of the things that designers are taught really early on in their craft, and often in school or just in general, is they're taught the art of critique, and critique or having your work challenged and broken down. One of the things that it does is it teaches you or trains you to be objective about what you're doing and not take stuff personally. And for a lot of designers, people like designers are argumentative. No, like they're really trying to understand how to keep that tension, because the tension is eventually what causes the interesting new stuff to pop out. And I mean, that's why there's the notion of creative tension. So it's not about conflict. It's not about destroying stuff, but it's about creating just enough tension for things to get popped out of place a little bit. And it's a very, very subtle thing. So in our practice, when we start with a new client, my business partner, who's an economist by training, he introduced this thing. We always start with the stock price or the level of investment that they have had. So that's where we start our problem solving as designers for a company. What's their stock price? Because then you can say, well, the executive of that organization is probably going to be standing up a few times a year in front of these folks, in front of the world and in front of the company, and they're going to use language to shape the direction, right? So what word can we push to the organization through our research and design and product development work? What can we push to the organization that shows up in the CEO's speech so they can shape the world a little bit better, like a single word, right? So when we're talking about that, we're talking about like a single word. And I don't want to, I'm not going to give examples because, respect for their clients and everything else, but we literally think about what word or words.
How many words does it take before they actually accept it?
Well, I'll tell you, it's crazy. Like we talk about the timeline when we work with organizations, it's like 5 years, right? For some of our clients who've been around that long, others were just getting there. And so we aren't playing like a short game. We understand that change takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort, and it's words. And sometimes words and artifacts are the same thing. So the thing you create really matters, but it's a slow game. And as a consulting organization like ours, you're also only as good as your next idea. So the mindset really, really matters because that's the consistent thing that pushes through. And it's your mindset doesn't replace theirs. It provides the perspective or challenges. So you're talking about the words. In the words, you test the words and see which ones work and which ones don't, but you're really trying to put a different way of thinking in play, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a second challenge.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not there.
There's a whole book on this, and I can connect you with one of the folks who wrote it. It's really interesting because they go through the whole thing, and then there's a lot of stuff that's very similar to. There's a lot of second order cybernetics rolled up in this, and all kinds of other stuff like feedback loops and everything else. But the language thing is tough, and like you saw our kind of experience going through using all this complex language and then getting down to basically we think in systems, we dream in software. Like that's the simple language that you can actually repeat 1,000 times. And most people think it's kind of glib and goofy, but it's actually very powerful because the notion of telling people that they can dream about something is like way more compelling and easy to accept than saying like, you're going to think about the computational power network systems. Keep that for the practitioners, but for the people who don't speak our language, we go much simpler. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Really appreciate you talking about mindset. I wanted to go to the example with Praxis.
Sure.
And I know you were moving a little.
Yeah, no problem.
Fast.
There were.
I want to know more so about how the outcome, which was what you designed. Like how's that shaped? I think it was the Praxis app.
Yeah.
I'm assuming the Peak app.
Oh, the Peak app. Yeah. How it shaped us.
Or how it was shaped from this whole like process of mindset and working with this.
So this is great. When I told our team that we were going to design ski equipment based on data exhaust, and we're going to design the whole stack, hardware, software, skis, everything else, they basically said like, it's impossible. We can't do it. Like these are designers working for a firm that's supposed to be doing innovation work, and like we can't do it. It's beyond us. It makes us uncomfortable. And so, talk about like changing mindset. I literally phoned up those guys in California, that ski company, and I said, I'm flying down with like a big container of sensors and wires and everything else, and I put some test schematics together. I want to know if you can help me put these in skis. And they said, you sound kind of crazy. And I said, well, I'm coming on this day. And they didn't actually expect us to show up. But we showed up. We showed up and knew that they're totally the right folks. And so sat down, we worked through the stuff, we worked it out. They produced the stuff. We got the stuff about a week later, and it showed up in a bunch of long, narrow shipping boxes, and we unpacked them for the team. And at that point, when the team saw them and saw that like step number one, which they had thought was impossible to do, had been done, totally changed their expectation of what was possible. And so I tried the language of we can do this, and the whiteboard's full of all this stuff and everything else. Didn't change their mind. So that type of stuff, the artifact was where we really got that going. And then we were able to talk about everything else and move it back into language and everything else. But the artifact really mattered. And the artifact, we talk about tension, the artifact was a provocation for the team. And we have a fairly healthy and free range team at work. I'm a very weak CEO. We have a very strong team, if that makes sense. We're really trying to run like a organization that's not top heavy. But periodically, it's really important if you understand the power of the influence that you have to go and make the thing. And so for this project, I mean, that was literally some of the early stages where, you know, we actually drilled holes in skis and like made custom cores and all that other stuff to get it done. And the shaping of the mindset there was literally the irony of this was that it was Praxis, the creation of theory through action. The funny thing is I went to these folks and I said, Praxis, what an amazing name for a ski company. He's like, well, you know, we kind of discovered it afterwards, but initially it just sounded really cool. Right. And I was like, it sounds awesome. Because I had gone and said, well, Praxis, I mean, does this mean you folks are like into liberation theology and all these other things and everything else? And he was like, I don't know what you're talking about. Make skis. They taught us a lot about you know, simplicity and mindset, you know. And I like trying to study and learn from other organizations around that type of stuff. So simple really matters. That's been one of the hardest things for me to kind of internalize. I don't know if that totally answered your question, but the building it was it's important. I think that's why the work we do is really, really cool, because we get to build stuff every day.
And what was the peak app like?
Oh, the peak app was almost inconsequential. We basically we ended up making an app. The funny story about this is we built all this infrastructure out. We went and said, okay, customer development. We're going to go test this. So we got a booth at a big international ski show and flew down, and we showed it as if it was a completed product, and we did the whole customer validation thing and everything else to understand like market size and all that other stuff, and found there's two markets. The first market is for large national ski teams like the Austrian ski team, the US ski team, the US freestyle team. They'd pay about $1 million a year for something like this. So there are probably about 20 customers in the world, right? The other market was that parents wanted surveillance systems for their kids to tell them when their kids fell down the hill, and there was a huge market for that. And what we did was we stepped back and said, you know, this is really interesting because we don't actually need sensors in the skis or complex technology in the skis to model when somebody falls. You just need an iPhone with the right code. And so we said, well, if we want to do that, then we're just going to assume that any kid over X age is going to do that. Or we can build something for like $15 that will basically, you know, tiny GSM chip and all that other, just the right sensors. So it turns into like a $15 thing you put in a kid's pocket. So that's where we netted out. And then we kind of said, you know, this is interesting to us, but we're not sure we want to be in the world of manufacturing stuff like this in an industry that's shrinking, right? So it's an incredibly shrinking industry for all kinds of different reasons. Lots of people still skiing, but yeah. So that's where it netted out. But the lesson for us actually was that almost everything can come back to software now. So all this stuff can just become a bunch of lines of code, because most people are walking around with a much better sensor outfit than I could ever put into a ski. And it's about the model you have and the data you have, not where the sensors necessarily are. So that's where we netted out on this.
I think we would
You were all out
like
of
to
time?
keep you talking forever, but we are out of time.
Cool. Thanks so much for having me. The audience in here was great. Folks online, I hope you could hear me, and it's good. Didn't follow the back channel. Sorry about that. But thanks again. It's my pleasure to come here. Thanks for listening. If anyone wants to continue the conversation, I can dig out business cards. And folks are welcome to email me we're generally talking with folks about this stuff just from a practice perspective on a regular basis. And our focus on all this is actually to connect people with folks. So, for example, if you folks are talking about that, I have somebody I should connect you with who's a retired senior U.S. Army person, worked for Stratcom and studied this stuff for years, and then got into teaching and ran a big chunk of